It's 1923. Orchard Street, Lower East Side. The air smells like pickles, coal smoke, and something frying 3 floors up. Push carts everywhere. Tenement building so crowded, 3 families share a single room. This is where hundreds of thousands of Russian immigrants landed, with almost nothing in a city that wasn't waiting for them. And every single night, in those cramped kitchens with their single gas burners and chipped pots, someone was cooking. Not for a restaurant, not to impress anyone, just to keep the family alive one more day. Today, we're walking through 25 of those dishes, and I promise you, by the time we reach number 20, you will never look at a cup of tea the same way again. 1. The garlic heel. It cost nothing. It tasted like everything. The heel of a loaf of stale black bread, the hard end piece that nobody wanted, was rubbed vigorously with a raw clove of garlic until the garlic almost dissolved into the rough surface of the crust. Then a pinch of salt. That was it. Workers called it the poor man's steak. And they weren't wrong. The garlic released its oils into the bread, sharp and pungent and warm. The salt hit the back of your tongue. The stale crust, which had been almost inedible on its own, became something with flavor. Real flavor. That could carry you through a morning shift at a garment factory on the 7th floor of a building with no ventilation. This was not a recipe. It was a technique. A piece of knowledge passed between workers on lunch breaks, between neighbors on tenement stoops, between anyone who needed to eat and had almost nothing to eat with. The garlic heel asks nothing of you except a heel of bread and a clove of garlic. In 1923 on the Lower East Side, that was the definition of affordable luxury. And the next dish built on the same logic. Taking something that cost nothing and turning it into something that tasted like it should have cost a great deal more. 2. Schmaltz dipped rye. In the Russian Jewish immigrant kitchen, schmaltz, rendered chicken or goose fat, was not a condiment. It was a currency. A communal bowl of schmaltz sat on the kitchen table. Dense rye bread was torn and dipped into it. The fat coated the bread completely, heavy and rich. Something close to 1,000 calories of fuel for a body working 12-hour days in a garment factory, or hauling ice up tenement stairs. The schmaltz itself was made carefully, nothing wasted. Chicken skin and fat scraps were rendered slowly with onion, until the fat ran clear and the skin crisped into golden bits called gribbeens. The fat went into a jar. The gribbeens were eaten immediately, standing over the stove, because they were too good to wait for. Rich tasting, deeply satisfying, made from the parts of the chicken nobody else wanted. That was the genius of this kitchen. It found value in everything everyone else had already thrown away. 3. Fried bread with skvarki. And speaking of those crispy bits, nothing was wasted. Not a single one. Skvarki, the crispy skin and fat remnants left in the pan after rendering schmaltz, were saved and used to fry bread. Thick slices of rye laid into a hot pan, still slicked with fat, pressed down until the underside turned dark gold and crackling, then flipped. The result was dense, salty, shatteringly crisp on the outside and chewy in the middle. Eaten hot from the pan, it was genuinely extraordinary. The rendered fat had a depth that butter can't replicate. The skvarki bits, clinging to the surface, added crunch and savory intensity that made you reach for another piece before the first one was finished. This dish existed because nothing could be wasted. And that constraint produced something wonderful. Some of the best food in the world comes from having almost nothing to work with. 4. Sour cream and black bread. Some evenings there was no time and no energy for anything more than this. A thick slice of black rye bread, a generous spoonful of smetana, sour cream, thick and tangy, spread across the top, a heavy pinch of salt. The cold dinner. The end-of-week dinner, made when the week had taken everything and left behind only the need to eat something before falling asleep. Sour cream was one of the most beloved staples of the Russian immigrant kitchen. Affordable, reasonably long-lasting, it transformed simple things, bread, potatoes, soup, into something that tasted like comfort rather than deprivation. The combination of dense sour rye and cool smetana with salt needs nothing added. It has been complete for centuries. Sitting at a tenement table at 10 o'clock at night, too tired to cook, eating bread and sour cream in the dark. That was a person who had worked all day and was still feeding themselves. That was enough. 5. Pickle brine kasha. This dish was born from pure necessity and became something surprisingly good. When the barrel pickle vendors on Hester Street sold their last pickle, the brine remained, and that sharp, salty, fermented liquid that smelled powerfully of dill and garlic. Most people walked past it. Russian immigrant cooks took it home. Buckwheat groats boiled in pickle brine instead of plain water absorbed the salt and the tang and the faint sourness of fermentation into every grain. The result was kasha that needed nothing added. No salt because the brine provided it. No fat because the flavor was already there, working. It also cost nothing. The brine was free, or nearly free. The buckwheat was cheap. And, together they made something that tasted seasoned and complex, in a way that cost-free things rarely do. This was immigrant cooking at its most ingenious. Not just making do with less, but understanding that what everyone else threw away still had value. That the brine left at the bottom of the barrel was not garbage. It was an ingredient. That kind of thinking fed families through the hardest winters. And it deserves more credit than it has ever been given. 6. Kasha Varnishkes, New York style. Here is where the Old World met the New World in a pot. In Russia and Eastern Europe, kasha had always been mixed with other things. But in New York City in the 1920s, something new appeared in the market stalls. Factory-made bow tie pasta. Farfalle. Cheap, shelf-stable, easy to cook. Someone mixed the buckwheat with the bow ties, added caramelized onion, finished with schmaltz. Kasha Varnishkes was born. A completely American invention built from Russian instinct and New York availability. The buckwheat gave it earthy depth. The pasta gave it something lighter. The onion tied it together. The schmaltz made it sing. By the 1920s, it was everywhere on the Lower East Side. At Shabbat tables, boarding house dinners, the lunch counters of Jewish delicatessens beginning to open on 2nd Avenue. Already a classic. Already belonging to nowhere, exactly and completely at home in New York. Some of the best things are made when two worlds touch each other in a kitchen. 7. Gretcheniki. Fried kasha cakes. No kasha was ever wasted. This dish made sure of it. Leftover buckwheat porridge, cooled, thickened, congealed into a solid mass in the pot overnight, was scooped out in spoonfuls, shaped by hand into rough patties, and pressed flat into a pan of hot fat. They sizzled immediately. The outside crisped and browned. The inside stayed dense and soft. Gretcheniki were the next morning's breakfast from last night's kasha, or they were lunch from breakfast's leftovers. The timeline didn't matter. What mattered was that nothing sat in the pot uneaten, that every grain did its job twice, first as porridge, then as something fried and new. Eating a warm Gretchen, fresh from the pan, slightly crisp on the outside and yielding in the middle, that was a small morning pleasure. Not extravagant, not exciting, but reliable, warm, something to look forward to in a life that didn't always offer many things to look forward to. Small pleasures matter. They always have. And this next dish gave people something to look forward to in a completely different way. Something tart and fizzy, and alive that cost almost nothing to make. 8. Buckwheat bullets in water. Dense, heavy, built for survival. These were not elegant dumplings. They were small, rough balls of flour and buckwheat mixed with water and a little salt, rolled quickly between the palms and dropped into boiling salted water. They sank to the bottom and slowly rose as they cooked. Fat, solid little things that landed in the stomach like ballast. They were called bullets in the kitchens of the Lower East Side, and the name fit. They were serious food, filling in a way that nothing light or delicate can match. You ate a bowl of buckwheat bullets, and you did not feel hungry for a long time afterward. That was the entire point. On a budget of pennies a day, the most important quality a dish could have was staying power. Not flavor first, not beauty first, but the ability to fuel a body through hours of physical labor without asking for more. The buckwheat bullets delivered that. Quietly. Without pretense, every single time. 9. Tenement shchi. Water. Sauerkraut. Potato. Salt. That is the whole ingredient list for tenement shchi. The thinnest, most stretched version of the great Russian cabbage soup, reduced to its essentials by the economics of a 1920s Lower East Side boarding house. In New York, sauerkraut replaced the fresh cabbage. It was cheap, kept forever, and available from barrel vendors on every corner. Potato chunks added body. Water filled the pot. Salt went in last. The result was thin and sour and warming in the way that hot liquid in a cold tenement on a February night can be warming even when it contains very little. The sourness of the sauerkraut gave the broth a personality that plain water couldn't. Shchi was made in large pots because boarding houses had many mouths to feed. Men renting cot space, cousins just off the boat, neighbors invited because there was enough for one more. And there was always enough for one more. That generosity, that insistence on stretching just a little further, was granted one of the most beautiful things about those kitchens. 10. Clear beet rosol. This was not soup in the way we usually think of soup. Clear beet rosol, a thin, strained broth made from beets boiled in water with a little salt and vinegar, was drunk from a cup like tea in the unheated rooms of winter tenements. No bowl, no spoon, no table setting. You wrapped both hands around the cup and drank. The broth was deep ruby red, faintly sweet from the beet, faintly sour from the vinegar, and hot in a way that traveled from your hands through your chest and settled somewhere in your middle like a small fire. On a winter morning when the pipes had frozen and the coal stove wasn't keeping up with the cold through the walls, a cup of hot beet rosol was medicine as much as food. It cost almost nothing. Beets were among the cheapest vegetables available, but it gave back warmth. And warmth in those winters was everything. 11. Pearl barley meatless gruel. Barley has a quality most other grains don't have. Boil it long enough and it releases a starch that thickens the water around it. The result somewhere between soup and porridge, gelatinous and clinging to the spoon. Pearl barley meatless gruel was exactly this. Barley boiled in water until thick, flavored with nothing more than onions cooked down until deeply caramelized, almost brown, almost sweet. Then stirred through until every spoonful carried that savory depth. No meat, no stock, no butter. Just barley, onion, and thyme. The onion was the key. Raw onion is sharp and aggressive. Cook it long enough, 30 minutes, until it collapses and darkens, and it becomes almost meaty, deeply savory, in a way that surprised everyone who hadn't encountered this before. Caramelized onion was the secret weapon of the immigrant kitchen. It cost almost nothing and transformed almost everything it touched. 12. Hand-torn dough in broth. When there was no time to roll dough and cut it properly, there was still a way to have dumplings. A rough dough of flour, water, and salt was mixed quickly and torn by hand into uneven pieces directly over a pot of simmering vegetable broth. They fell in ragged and irregular, nothing like the neat dumplings of a careful cook, and cooked in minutes into soft, chewy, unbeautiful things that tasted exactly right. These were called lazy dumplings. The name was practical, not critical. In a tenement kitchen at the end of a 12-hour workday, lazy was not a character failing. It was a reasonable response to exhaustion. The broth beneath the dumplings did as much work as the dumplings themselves. Together they made something that felt like a real meal, from almost no ingredients and almost no effort. That efficiency was its own kind of genius. 13. Solyanka, pot scrapings, stew. This was the end-of-week dish, the accounting dish, the one that looked at everything left in the kitchen and made one final meal from all of it. Solyanka in its Lower East Side version was whatever remained. Pickle bits, cabbage scraps, a small piece of meat, if there happened to be any, leftover broth, a spoonful of tomato. Combined in a pot, heated through, seasoned with salt and vinegar until sharp and salty, and complex in a way that made no sense given its ingredients. The sourness of pickle, the richness of whatever fat remained, the faint sweetness of cabbage, all of it came together in a broth that tasted like a week's worth of cooking distilled into a single bowl. Nothing was wasted. The Solyanka was the proof that this kitchen had been run with care and intelligence all week. Every scrap had found its purpose. And now, stirred together in the end-of-week pot, all those bits became dinner one final time before the week began again. 14. Pushcart, herring and onion. The pushcart herring sellers worked the streets of the Lower East Side every day, their barrels drawing customers from half a block away by smell alone. The herring was aggressively salty, cured hard in brine, intensely flavored in a way that fresh fish never is. On its own, it could be overwhelming. But sliced and laid across thin rounds of raw white onion, something happened. The sharpness of the onion cut through the intensity of the cure. The two flavors met in the middle and produced something balanced, briny, sharp, satisfying, that cost almost nothing. Eaten standing at the cart or wrapped in paper and taken to a nearby stoop, or stretched across an hour with a piece of rye bread alongside. The curing of herring, the pairing with raw onion, These were techniques going back centuries in Eastern Europe, brought whole to New York and sold from a barrel on a street corner. Ancient knowledge. New city. Same perfect result. 15. Vinaigrette. Survival salad. This was the salad of storage vegetables, of the things that lasted. Beets, boiled, cooled, cubed. Potatoes, boiled, cooled, cubed. Sour pickles, chopped rough. A pour of sunflower oil. A pinch of salt. The beet stained everything it touched a deep, vivid purple red. The finished salad looked almost dramatic, bright and jewel-like on a chipped plate in a tenement kitchen, more festive than it had any right to be. The sourness of pickle against the earthiness of beet and the neutrality of potato was a combination that worked, that had always worked, that Russian and Ukrainian cooks had been making for generations. Cheap. Filling. Genuinely good. And it kept well, appearing on the table more than once in the same week without anyone minding. 16. Tvarog and radish plate. When there was no meat and no fish and nothing to cook, there was still this. Tvarog, farmer's cheese, crumbly and tangy, was paired with sliced radishes, the cheap, vivid red radishes available from pushcarts for almost nothing. The Tvarog provided protein. The radishes provided crunch and heat. Together they made something that felt like more than the sum of its parts. You ate it with black bread. 3 textures, 3 flavors, all of them simple, all of them working together without effort. There is a satisfaction in food that doesn't try to be clever, that just puts 3 honest things on a plate and trusts that they are enough. The Tvarog and radish plate was exactly that. It knew what it was. It didn't pretend to be anything else. And that honesty, in a life requiring enormous energy just to get through the day, was its own kind of comfort. 17. Sunflower oil potatoes. The sunflower oil was not from a store on Orchard Street. It came from home. Unrefined sunflower oil, dark, deeply nutty, smelling almost the seeds themselves, was brought from the old country in bottles, treated as a luxury because in New York it was hard to find and expensive to replace. Families rationed it carefully. Boiled potatoes, dressed with a pour of this oil and a pinch of salt, were transformed immediately. That nutty, rich, completely particular flavor changed the potato from a bland staple into something that tasted specific and beloved, and from somewhere. When the oil ran out, families used whatever was available, and the dish was fine. But when the good oil was there, eating those potatoes was a moment of genuine pleasure, a small thing. But small things in the middle of difficulty carry enormous weight. 18. Cold meat bone jelly. Colodettes. Nothing was wasted, and this dish was the proof of that principle taken to its furthest point. Colodettes was made from the cheapest possible animal parts, feet, neck bones, knuckles, that cost almost nothing because they contained almost no meat. But they contained collagen, enormous amounts of it, packed into connective tissue and bone. Those parts were simmered for hours in water with onion, bay leaf, and peppercorn until the broth turned thick and gelatinous. The small amounts of meat were picked from the bones and placed in a bowl. The broth was strained over the top. The whole thing went to the windowsill overnight, the tenement refrigerator, and by morning it had set into a firm, wobbly jelly. Sliced cold with mustard and black bread, Colodettes tasted expensive because making it required patience and knowledge even when it required almost no money. The people who made it well were proud of that. Rightly so. 19. Stale crust kvass. On a sunny windowsill on the Lower East Side, a jar was working. Inside it, burnt or stale bread crusts submerged in water, beginning to ferment. After a few days in the warmth, the liquid transformed, slightly sour, faintly fizzy, smelling of yeast and rye, tasting like the bread it came from, but alive in a new way. This was kvass, the fermented bread drink that Russians had been making for centuries, reinvented in New York from bread scraps that couldn't be eaten any other way. Mildly alcoholic, cooling in summer, warming in winter. And it cost absolutely nothing. Made from crusts that had already served their purpose as bread and were now serving their purpose again. The bread that kept on giving. Right until the very last drop. 20. Tea through a sugar cube. Stop here for a moment, because this one is different from everything else on this list. This is not a dish. It is not even quite a meal. It is a practice, a discipline, a small daily ritual that tells you more about life on the Lower East Side in the 1920s than almost anything else could. Sugar was not cheap. A family on a garment worker's wages could not afford to sweeten every cup of tea freely, so the sugar was rationed with extraordinary care. A single cube of sugar was placed between the front teeth. The tea, hot, strong, black, was sipped slowly through the cube. The heat dissolved the sugar gradually, releasing just enough sweetness into each sip to make the tea taste sweet without consuming the cube. One cube could last through 2 cups, sometimes 3. The discipline was in the sipping. Slow, deliberate, making each mouthful count. This was not poverty performing itself for an audience. This was a private act done alone or with family at the end of a long day. A person sat down. They made tea. They placed the sugar between their teeth, and for 15 minutes they rested. The tea was hot. The sweetness was real, even if it was rationed. And that rest, that 15 minutes of warmth and sweetness at the end of everything, was as important as any food on this list. It was the thing that made it possible to get up and do it again tomorrow. 21. Lokshen in diluted milk. This was children's food. The dish made when a child was sick or tired, or simply needed something soft and gentle. Hand-cut noodles. Lokshen, made from flour, egg, and water, rolled thin and cut into rough strips, were boiled in water with just a splash of milk. Not enough to make it rich. Just enough to soften the broth slightly, give it a faint creaminess that plain water didn't have. The noodles were soft. The broth was mild. The whole bowl steamed gently and smelled like nothing threatening at all. Children ate it without resistance. It was the dish that could be eaten when nothing else could. Mothers made it by instinct. No recipe needed. A handful of flour, an egg, a splash of milk. The hands knew what to do. They had always known. 22. Apple compote with bread sopping. Tart apples, the cheap ones, bruised and soft-spotted, sold for almost nothing at the end of market day, were simmered in water with little sugar until they fell apart into a loose, fragrant compote. The apples were eaten first. Warm, soft, faintly sweet and sour. Dessert made from damaged fruit nobody else had wanted. Then the cooking liquid remained. That sweet apple-flavored water was not poured out. Hard bread was broken into it, left to soak until soft and expanded and edible again. Bread that had been too stale to eat on its own, now perfectly good. Nothing wasted. Not the apple. Not the water it cooked in. Not the bread everyone had given up on. This was the philosophy of the tenement kitchen in a single bowl. Everything has a second purpose. Nothing ends before it has to. 23. Savory oatmeal with fried onions. Oatmeal in America in the 1920s meant breakfast. Sweet, perhaps, with a little sugar, a morning food. In the Russian immigrant kitchen, oatmeal was not bound by that convention. A pot of plain oatmeal, cooked until thick, was topped with onions, fried dark and soft in whatever fat was available. Salt went in generously. Sometimes a splash of pickle brine for tartness. The result was dinner, or lunch. Whatever meal needed to appear when there was oatmeal in the cupboard and very little else. Removing a food from its expected category, using it differently, was a skill the immigrant kitchen practiced constantly. Nothing was only one thing. Everything could become something else, if you were willing to think about it differently. 24. Boiled turnips and salt. In the early 1920s, there were weeks when turnips were cheaper than potatoes, and in a kitchen where every penny was tracked, that price difference mattered. Turnips dropped into salted boiling water, cooked until soft, the same way you'd cook a potato because that was exactly the job they were doing. Pale, dense, faintly bitter in a way that salt almost completely covered. Nobody pretended they were exciting. They were filling, affordable, and contained what a body working 12-hour days needed to keep functioning. But here's the thing about food eaten often enough under difficult conditions. It begins to carry its own comfort, not the comfort of deliciousness, the comfort of reliability, of knowing this will be here, of knowing this will be enough. And the final dish on this list brought everything together one last time in a single pan, with a single purpose at the end of the hardest week. 25. Leftover everything mash. Sunday, the end of the week. The accounting. Whatever grains had been cooked and not fully eaten, kasha, barley, a handful of oatmeal. Whatever tubers remained, potato, turnip, beet. Whatever scraps of fat or broth were left at the bottom of any pot. All of it went into a single pan. Mashed together with whatever implement was available. A fork, the back of a spoon, a wooden pestle. Pressed into the pan and fried until the bottom formed a crust, and the top was hot all the way through. It was not pretty. It was not the same twice, because it was never made from the same ingredients twice. It could be salty or slightly sweet, or sharply sour, depending on what the week had contained. But it was always enough, it was always warm, and frying it, pressing that mash flat into the pan and hearing it sizzle, used the last bit of fat, the last bit of heat, the last bit of energy that the week had to offer. Then the pan was washed. The week was finished, and tomorrow the shelf would be restocked as best it could be, and the whole cycle would begin again. This was not a recipe. It was a practice, a weekly act of completion and beginning, of refusing to let anything go to waste while there was still someone who needed to eat. That refusal, quiet, persistent, practiced every single week without drama, was one of the most powerful things happening in those tenement kitchens. It still is. We started on Orchard Street. The smell of pickles and coal smoke, push carts in the cold, a pot of something simmering 3 floors up. Now you know what was in that pot. You know what the garlic heel tasted like at 7 in the morning before a factory shift. You know what it meant to ration a single cube of sugar through 2 cups of tea. You know what Solyanka was made of and why. All those scraps gathered through the week into something that tasted, somehow, like more than the sum of its parts. These 25 dishes are the record of something real, of hundreds of thousands of people who arrived in New York City with almost nothing, and fed themselves and their children through intelligence, patience, and an absolute refusal to waste anything that still had use left in it. That wisdom didn't disappear when families moved out of the tenements and into better apartments in the Bronx and Brooklyn. It traveled with them. It shows up today in Jewish delicatessens, still serving kasha varnishkis on 2nd Avenue. In Eastern European grocery stores still selling schmaltz and black bread and barrel pickles. And every grandmother who still says, "Don't throw that away, I can use that." The food survived. The knowledge survived. The people survived. Don't forget where food comes from. Don't forget what it cost. Don't forget the people who figured out how to make something from almost nothing and fed a generation on what everyone else had already thrown away. Leave a comment and tell me, which dish stopped you cold? Which one did you not expect? And if you want to know about the next immigrant story and the interesting foods they ate, please click the next video. Thank you for watching.